Great, thanks, Susan. Great summary. Obviously, a lot of interesting insights already out of the early stages of this work, but we're sure that there's many more things that are happening in your own organizations that we'd love to hear about. This is early stage work for us, and we'd like to continue it going forward. And so again, kind of getting a bit of insights from you today would be really helpful as we look to shape some of this future work. So as I mentioned at the outset, what we'd like to do is use the kind of Poll Everywhere platform for kind of picking your brain a bit on what you're seeing in your own organizations. So to participate in these polls, what you need to do is either log into a web browser on your phone or on your computer at pollev.com/Brad Bell, or you can text my name, Brad Bell, to 22333, and then you'll be kind of in the polls. And for each of the questions that come up, you'll just be able to submit your responses. So we'll start out with what I think is hopefully an easy one, but really kind of curious to hear about whether your business has experienced some of the workforce tensions, cliques, or negative events that we've been talking about that are really kind of enforced or reinforced by these strongly held differing opinions. So if you have, you can submit A, and if not, please indicate B. I see some results filtering in here, which is great. So we see the responses coming in. So it looks like pretty strong majority have experienced some of these issues that we've been referencing, which is in line with what I think Susan and I would have expected. Kind of curious about the 30% that haven't experienced any of this. Maybe it's because everyone's still remote and you're not back in person, or maybe there's something else about your organization that's allowed you to avoid some of these issues. Be really kind of curious to hear more about that. But let's move on to the next question. It's kind of digs a little bit deeper into these in terms of what you're actually seeing. So we're curious to hear about if you've experienced some of these clashes, what topics or issues have served as a source of these various conflicts within your organization. So you can just type in a word or two. The responses they come in should show up as a word bubble. So vaccination status seems to be a big one. Return to work, masks. Racial, we see here, justice. Voting rights. It's great. So clearly vaccination is still, looks like the kind of dominant one here, which is clearly a very salient one. And I think also has some connections with some of these others like politics, I think, and some of these other topics. So not surprising that's kind of a vector that's showing up. Great, so let's go on to the next question here. Are there any other issues beyond the ones that you just listed that you expect may show up when your workforce is fully back? Or maybe some of these ones that you highlighted, you expect them to become even more salient or more of a fault line when employees start to come back into the office on a regular basis. Again, a word or two. Well, I like the one, inequity and working flexibly. We've certainly heard that from a lot of organizations in terms of who has the opportunity or the freedom to kind of work hybrid or fully remote versus those that might, for work reasons, have to be in the workplace. See flexi type work as well there along the same lines, following protocols around related to the health and safety topic. And so it seems like, building on the last, in addition to these issues that we've already seen, a lot of it's going to be around return to work policies and practices, safe return to the office, as well as flexible work going forward. We just had one come in, upskill and training, interesting. Maybe in terms of who has access to those opportunities or not. Great. So kind of moving into the solutions, I think Susan shared a number of ones that we've heard again early on, but kind of curious what you've observed. Have you seen any effective strategies for handling these clashes, and maybe within your own organizations, and maybe what you've seen in other organizations? But we're kind of curious in terms of what are some of the effective approaches that you may have observed. I'm not seeing any responses yet. Maybe that means there's no effective approaches.
Yeah, that may be the answer, Brad.
Mediation, all right. So back to the fault lines that may exist around, having to be in the office versus remote. Maybe a more hybrid approach allows us to bridge some of those differences. So kind of interesting comment, doubtful about its effectiveness, but transparent conversations. But employee listening and regular communication on vision and strategy. Absolutely. So a lot here about communication, around the transparency, listening, having these open forums, as Susan talked about, for having these discussions. Great, so curious on the flip side, anything that you've tried or maybe you've seen others try that hasn't worked? Things that maybe we should avoid going forward? Oh, that's it. I think that goes to the kind of policies and practices that you were talking about, Susan.
Yep.
That's interesting. Kind of a top to bottom, top down. I think that's saying kind of a top down strategy really needs to be more maybe bottom up or bi-directional. I think going back to the earlier approach of having these forums and opportunities for dialogue and voice.
And training managers to be more comfortable with that two-way communications. Yeah.
All right, so I know we're short on time here, so I'm going to go on. Let's just have two more questions for you. Seeing work from home is not working. Absolutely. We have a couple more coming. So back to some of these distinctions between work models and how that might create fault lines. I think we were previously thinking about it as, maybe the people working from home were the privileged ones because they had that opportunity, but there also is also the risk that maybe they're seen as not as committed, not as productive while they're working from home. And certainly if we're going to have a lot of conversation and dialogue and listening, we need to follow up on that with action. A lot of research says the worst thing we can do is ask for voice and not listen or do anything about what people tell us. Great. So last question, I'm kind of curious about leaders in your organization. Where do you think they're at currently? How well equipped do you think they are to handle these clashes and conflicts when they arise? So if you think they're pretty well equipped, ready to go, you can select A. If you think some are well equipped, but many are well equipped, but there's some that maybe aren't quite there, B. You think there's a few leaders in your organization that can handle this, but many aren't quite prepared, that's C. And if you would say most are not well equipped, select D. All right, so it seems like the kind of dominant response here is some are well equipped, but many are not. So there are some leaders that just based on their skills, experience, are prepared for this, ready to handle it based on their, style perhaps, but many are not and need the kind of upskilling and training that Susan was talking about. So one final question for you, and we'll be wrapping up. So what are your thoughts around, to the kind of upskilling or training piece? Do you see particular skills or capabilities that you think would be particularly important for leaders to have in order to address these issues? Or maybe if you're thinking about the ones to the prior question, you'd say are well equipped, what do they have that maybe other leaders don't, that makes them well positioned to handle these issues? Listening skills, great one. Interesting. It's a lot about listening, empathy, defining clear vision and expectations, which is interesting, right? Because I think some of these we would say have always been strong leadership skills, team leadership skills, defining a clear mission, vision, expectations. But I think even more weight being put on the listening and empathy pieces. Clarity of verbiage, I like that. What is hybrid? What are we really talking about? And explaining why someone maybe is in one type of work model versus another. Susan, any reactions to any of the responses that have come in before we wrap up?
No, it's certainly very consistent with what we've heard from the companies that we've spoken to, for sure. And I do think no surprise around the leader skills. I think leaders would actually welcome some training around some of this because I know I would be concerned if it were coming at me every day. I'd want to be sure that I was equipped.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is very good, interesting.
Yes, thank you all for your responses. Very helpful for us.